Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on Forgotten Weapons. I am Ian McCollum, and our format's going to be a little bit different today. I had a bit of a time crunch in getting this month's Q&A out, so rather than have to spend a bunch of time, as I normally do, researching some of the questions, I specifically asked for lightning round style of questions. So I have like 7 pages of questions here, and they should all be fairly quick to go through. Let me know in the comments if you do or don't like this particular format. I do anticipate going back to the standard format next month, but if people really like this, maybe we'll do it again from time to time. Anyway, let's get started. First question is from Thomas, said, first older firearm you purchased for yourself. That would be a Colt model of 1903 pistol in 32 ACP. Still really like those. Also, what made me interested in French rifles as opposed to other nations, and that is really the diversity. As they say, no one copies the French and the French copy no one. They really did have kind of a substantially different series of firearms than most other countries did, largely because they were all produced domestically and not shipped out for export. So Germans used the Mauser, and the Mauser company looked to export its guns all over the world. Well, the French state arsenals weren't really exporting to anybody at all. So you end up with firearms that are pretty unique to France. Any plans to come to the New York City area for the 100th anniversary or Armistice Day? If I could get away with it, my plans would never involve going to New York City. Not a big fan of being in New York City. I'm hoping actually to be in Europe for Armistice Day. For those of us going to Paris this year, any recommendations for museums, etc.? Yes, the one obvious recommendation to make is the Musée des Armées. The Paris Army Museum has a whole bunch of stuff. It's not quite as, it's not one of the really old school museums that just has rows and rows and rows of guns on the wall. However, it hasn't entirely fallen victim to the new school of museum design that involves, a helmet in the middle of a giant room with a little story about where it came from, and then a bunch of Wikipedia-like text on the walls. So there are still quite a lot of artifacts in the Paris Army Museum. They have a couple particular sections of really unusual and interesting prototype firearms that are pretty cool to take a look at. So I definitely recommend that museum if you're in Paris. Other than that, that's the one Army military museum that really comes to mind. Beyond that, I would say enjoy the other cultural aspects of Paris that it is known for. Mr. Doctor says, why, in your opinion, was the 10mm cartridge, despite being a good round ballistically and dimensionally, not explored further? I think it's basically just that the 10mm was too powerful of a round. That's not to say that it blew up pistols and no one could handle it. It is a commentary on the training budget and the training time that was available for law enforcement sorts of people. Yeah, if you're on the SWAT team and you do nothing every day except practice shooting and ballistic, or dynamic entries and such, fine, maybe you'll like 10mm, although I would argue that you shouldn't. The problem was, as a standard issue round for the FBI, it just required way more training than they were able or willing to give to troops, to officers, or agents, whatever you'd call them, and so it wasn't a practical cartridge to continue using. Even today, there is always a balance between capacity and cartridge size, and then between cartridge power and your ability to make repeat follow-up shots. And the 10mm is maybe more powerful of a cartridge than wise for a fighting handgun. I think something like 9mm has become very popular for good reason. It runs a very nice balance between ballistic power and follow-up capability and recoil. Joseph says, other than your What Would Stoner Do rifle, what is your most shotgun and your least shotgun? Well, my least shotgun is a tie between a lot of different guns for 0 rounds. I have some things like a couple Chinese mystery pistols. I have a Khyber Pass manufactured Lee Enfield. Those are guns that I have not shot and don't ever plan to shoot. So that's definitely going to be least. As for the guns that I shoot the most, it's also kind of going to be a toss-up. I really enjoy my AK-74. I really enjoy my M1 Garand. I'd shoot a number of French rifles a lot more often if the ammunition were a little cheaper and more easily available. Yeah, I think really it comes down to the AR, the AK, and the M1. they're fantastic rifles, and they're a lot of fun to shoot. Adam says, I believe I heard you and Carl say on InRange that you guys felt 45 ACP was an obsolete cartridge. Sorry if I misremembered or misunderstood. Do you think 45 ACP is still viable for suppressed handguns or submachine guns? I think 45 ACP is primarily useful in suppressed firearms, much more so than anywhere else. I think generally what we just talked about with the 10 millimeter, 45 is a big cartridge. You can't fit nearly as many of them in a given space as you can something like 9mm. Ballistically, an expanding 9mm bullet is exactly as effective as a 45 caliber projectile. These are pistol rounds. They're both pistol rounds. Neither of them is going to have the terminal effect of a high velocity rifle round, and I don't know that you're going to make a lot of progress trying to get them there. So where 45 really does stand out is it's a better balance if you're restricted to below the speed of sound. So if I was going to do a lot of shooting with a 45, other than just recreationally, yeah, it would probably be for a suppressed firearm. Kyle says, best firearms manufacturer. There is none. Best for what? Are you looking for a economical mass production gun that anyone can buy, or are you looking to create the absolute best accuracy, or are you looking for literal aesthetic artwork? I mean, there are guns that are literal works of art, but if that's not what you're looking for, then the best person to make one of those isn't the best firearm manufacturer overall. So that is a question that literally has no correct answer. Corey says, pistol caliber carbines in the era of the SBR, useful or range toys? I would say both. I think if you look at, well, when you say useful, you're getting at, like, do they do what people are wanting them to do? Well, the vast, vast majority of firearms sold today are used recreationally, and pistol caliber carbines are quite a lot of fun to shoot. So I think they can be range toys and be useful at the same time, because range toys is mostly what people buy firearms to be. John says, what era of time produced the most forgotten weapons? And he suggests a couple different wars, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Cold War. I would say instead it is actually technological advancements that that create or lead to forgotten weapons. So I would say the development of breech-loading firearms is probably about the best one. You got a huge number of just experimental firearms that people came up with because nobody really knew the best way to do stuff, and so they tried everything conceivable. Some things that worked great and became very common, some things that worked terribly and are lost forever, or maybe not quite forever, but certainly aren't being made anymore. You'll see that when there's the move from muzzle loading to breech loading, when you see single shot firearms go to repeating firearms, when you see manually repeating firearms go to self-loading firearms. And I would say the oldest of those periods is probably the one that has now developed the most actual literal forgotten weapons. So I would go with the development of the breech loading firearm. TKB29671 says, what is the earliest semi-automatic centerfire rifle produced you are aware of? I would say that would be the 1888 Madsen Rasmussen, which I actually have a video filmed about that we'll be publishing at some point in the next couple months. They had one at the Danish National Firearms Museum in Copenhagen, and they let me take a look at it. That's a very cool gun, and I'm looking forward to when that video publishes. Christopher says, which unicorn firearm would you most like to get your hands on? Right now, that would be an RSC 1918. That's the 1917. Yeah, I don't think you can quite see that in camera frame. The 18 is the shorter carbine version of that with a much improved gas system and standard Berthier clips, and I would love to have one. They are extremely rare. Austin says, do shotguns have a place in modern militaries other than guarding prisoners or checkpoints? I would say probably not, primarily, or if for no other reason than the bulk of their ammunition. So in the space that I can carry a 30-round magazine of 5.56 ammo, I can carry, like 6 shotgun shells? That kind of restricts its capability. I think if it weren't for that, militaries, if they wanted to, could certainly develop doctrines around use of shotgun-type firearms, but nobody's going to because of the ammunition bulk. James says, since you love World War II history and always talk about small arms, how about something of a different flavor? Which piece of field artillery from the Great War are you most fond of? The answer to that, James, is I really know very little about field artillery and cannot provide any sort of informed answer to that question. I couldn't name enough pieces of World War I field artillery to make it useful. Jason says, I recently purchased a Smith & Wesson Model 1, very early little 22 black powder revolver. I would like to fire it, but can't seem to find any black powder 22 short ammunition. Do you know of anyone who still makes commercial black powder ammo? What would you recommend as an alternative? Yes, there is black powder or black powder substitute ammunition out there, but not for 22 rimfire cartridges. I would say the thing I would look at would be 22 CB caps, basically primer only, propelled, little tiny, extra short 22s. I would be a little bit dubious about shooting a Smith & Wesson number 1 just because they are so old and were designed with such early metallurgy. 22 CB cap is probably fine, but I would, if it were me personally, I would be looking for some experts specifically in that area to get their opinion before I actually went out and shot one. Jacob says, with all of the new calibers on the market, are any of them useful? How long until they are forgotten? I think as a general rule, none of them are useful. They will be forgotten quite quickly. There's always something of a place for people who are just trying to perfect towards some specific goal for shooting. But as a general rule, I think we've had cartridges that do a 98% good, perfect job at pretty much anything you want them to do, and we've had those for decades now. People are always coming up with new and different cartridges. Some people are doing it because they're genuinely trying to expand the market, and they think that they are creating, they legitimately think that what they're creating is better, and it probably is better. The question is whether it's better enough to be worth breaking into a market and creating new firearms chambered for. And there are also people who just introduce new cartridges as a business plan to separate you from your money. So before anyone adapts a brand new hot Wildcat sort of cartridge, I would ask, is there not an existing cartridge that really does what you need to do just fine already? Tim says, what is your favorite reference material for British small arms? Again, a very difficult question to answer because of the width and breadth of British small arms. There's a lot out there. I would say probably the most prevalent source is Ian Skennerton. I kind of wish some of his books were a little bit better organized, but the amount of raw information in them is pretty substantial. And he has a huge book on the Lee Enfield and all of its different variations. And he also has books on the Martini series. So right there, he's probably covering more than most. There's a great collector grade book on the Vickers by Dolph Goldsmith. There's a great collector grade book on the L85 series, the SA80, by Stephen Raw. And between those three, you've got a pretty good coverage of British small arms. Well, that's leaving out Webley's. There's some good books on Webley revolvers, too. Nicholas says, what is your favorite or least favorite airline? I don't think I've yet found an airline that I was actually be excited to use. As far as I can tell, they're all kind of equally grim. We've really commoditized airline travel these days, and it's just gonna suck no matter what, because people are more interested in what you pay for a ticket than in the actual level of service or comfort, short of first class. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone else. I'm always looking for the cheapest airline tickets I can find, and I just accept the fact that being in an airliner is basically being just stuffed into a, vague, just barely subsonic people tube that's gonna suck. How much time do you actually get to spend at home? Do you ever get tired of constant travel and filming? If trips get too long, yes, they do get tiresome. As it stands right now, I spend between about half of my time at home and the other half traveling. And I'm really at a point where I can't add any additional travel without substantially sacrificing other things. Travel to film is great, but there is also a lot of time involved in editing and research and putting video up and writing video description and planning for future video, plus, other things that I might actually like to do as well. And lastly from Nicholas, when will you shoot your Shaspo? I have no idea. I will at some point. I've been slowly picking up all of the components to do so. I really ought to apologize to Murphy's Muskets, who provided me with the equipment for forming my own paper cartridges. Had like 2 years ago probably, and I still haven't actually made use of it. If you're watching, I apologize. I will get to that at some point. No idea exactly when. Matthew says, what's the best kind of whiskey? That's easy. Scotch, and the peatier the better. Ian says, any military application, modern or historical, for subsonic ammunition? I would say the application for subsonic ammo is exactly the same as the military application for suppressors. That's really the one place where I think you would use subsonics is when you're running them in suppressors. So he wants to know primarily outside of special operations. I would say probably not. Not much outside of special operations. Ben says, what's the cheapest or best source for collector grade books? The gun show table from the guy who decided to sell a whole bunch and only wants $20 a piece. That actually literally is the best source I have ever found. I found one of those guys. He may be watching as well right now. Thank you for the books. Beyond that, collector grade books generally don't ever go down in value. The only ones that are cheap are like the one on the Shosha, because nobody cares about the Shosha. And so it's only like $40, which is its cover price. I don't think you will ever, short of the one dude at the gun show who just wants to get rid of them, I don't think you'll ever find collector grade books below their cover price. Scott says, are Calico light weapons on your radar? I think they're cool and interesting, but haven't seen you cover any yet. Do you have any opinions on them? Calico is one of those guns that I was just starting to get into when the assault weapons ban took effect, and so I've never really done a whole lot with them. They're definitely on my radar. As far as I can tell, in fact, I think I remember seeing them at SHOT Show last year. I think they're still in business. Honestly, I don't really know what the status of Calico is at this point, although having said that now, I'm sure there are people in the comments who will tell me. But yes, I plan to, at some point, cover a variety of the Calico firearms. For those of you who aren't aware, the primary thing that Calico did that was interesting was to use 50 and 100 round helical magazines, so spiral wound, very large magazines. They did 22s and 9mm. The 9mm is actually kind of interesting in that it is roller delay blowback, I believe. So, Larry says, do you have any French heritage, i.e. interest in French rifles? No, my heritage is largely Scottish. For what it's worth, the Scots and the French have long been allies because they long have hated the English. Christopher says, what was the first fully automatic firearm you got a chance to shoot? That would be an Uzi, and it was not a great experience because as a novice machine gun shooter, like at that point a completely novice machine gun shooter, and fairly young, the recoil was more than I was anticipating. I didn't have good trigger control. One of the keys to effectively using submachine guns is short bursts until you really understand and are practiced at controlling the recoil in them. And then on top of that, this Uzi had a folding metal stock, which just truly sucks, especially for a beginner. Tim says, why was there such a huge time gap between when the U.S. Armed Forces saw mass adoption of semi-auto pistols and when police forces adopted semi-auto pistols? I'm pretty sure that's just because revolvers did everything that the police needed just fine. And there was no need to get rid of them and introduce the additional training requirements that you would have for a semi-automatic pistol that has a wholly different style of operation. Revolvers stayed popular in the US for a very long time. It's hard to go wrong with 6 rounds at .357. It really just worked. Mads says, has there ever been an attempt at a military straight pull rifle with a bent bolt? Yes or no? No, to the best of my knowledge. The bent bolt is there to give you more leverage to unlock the thing. If it's a straight pull, there's no need for the bend because you're not turning the bolt handle. Jasper says, you are going on a World War I trench raid. You can choose a shotgun or MP18 and a Luger, 1911 or 1917 rifle. No, I'm sorry. You can choose a shotgun or MP18 and a Luger, a 1911, a 1917 revolver, either Colt or Smith & Wesson. What do you choose? That is a super easy thing. I would choose the MP18 without any hesitation whatsoever. Sven says, your house is on fire. You can only save 3 guns from your entire collection. What are they? I would say my FAMAS, because it's stupidly expensive. My MAS 38. No, you know what? I think I would take the RSC 1917 as number 2, and my What Would Stoner Do rifle as number 3. Jamie says, in your opinion, what bullpup weapon do you consider to be the best overall? That would be, in military service, I would say the FAMAS. In general, I think there's a strong case to be made for the F2000, the FN F2000. It has some advantages in things like being able to mount optics that, most of the military bullpups are pre-optics, or they have built-in optics that kind of suck in comparison to everything that's available today. So the AUG, the FAMAS, the L85, these are all guns that were, well, I'm correcting myself on the fly. The L85 was actually specifically designed to be used with an optical sight. It, however, is a terrible gun. Most of the other early ones were developed pre-optic, and so putting optics on them is kind of a kludge. I guess the AUG is better at that, certainly better at that than the FAMAS is. But the FAMAS had a lot going for it. Today, it's hard to beat the F2000. Because it is fully ambidextrous, it's forward ejecting, so you just don't have to deal with left-right issues at all, and it's easy to mount any sort of optic on it that you like. John, what Soviet, Russian, experimental, or prototype Russian small arms from the Cold War would you like to examine if you got the chance? All of them. Definitely all of them. If I had to prioritize it, I would start with the, TKB 17, something like that. Basically the one that people are most familiar with, which is as a result the one that I get the most requests for. But ultimately, I'd like to take a look at any of them. Without having examined any in person, it's really hard or impossible to say which is the coolest. So we'll start with one and just work our way through all of them if we ever have the chance. Another Ian says, can you please do a video like the one you did on Canadian gun laws for all the other countries that you visit? Certainly something I will consider. One of the issues that prevents me from doing that is, one, I have to find a person who is fluent in English and also very fluent in that country's gun laws. There are always going to be mistakes in those videos because pretty much every country's gun laws are a kind of crazy mesh of loopholes and exceptions and alternatives. The U.S. is certainly no exception to that rule. But the other thing that's going on is if I'm in a foreign country filming about guns, I often have to make the choice of, do I film one more gun from this cool collection, or do I do a video on the gun laws in this country? And given that choice, I pretty much always go with one more gun from the collection because that's kind of more interesting. The Canadian one was something we were able to do during a time period when I was up there that there wasn't an opportunity to do other firearms filming, so it made sense. If I can repeat that, I would like to. I think it is interesting to have some baseline understanding of what are the different gun laws in different places. Certainly most Americans have a very vague view, which is basically in Europe you can't have them, which is not the case, and it would be worth finding out when you can. All right, Steven says, why were there no attempts to mass produce a suppressed rifle for the majority of the 20th century? I presume he means militarily. I think a big reason for that is actually that the noise is valuable. If you're in a big gun battle back and forth, everyone's keeping their heads down because they're getting shot at, right? Well, if you don't know you're getting shot at, it's hard to know that you're supposed to be suppressed, so to speak. And actually, you have this working in both directions. Hearing your squad mates actually shooting and making a lot of noise helps bolster one's confidence. Being shot at, hearing bullets fired, especially large volumes of them, hearing machine guns, that tends to really give you this psychological clue that, hey, I am in a gunfight and there's a lot of bad guys over there and they're trying to hurt me and I should probably do things to make sure I don't get killed. You give a bunch of guys all suppressed weapons and they kind of, I think they lose a lot of psychological power in a battle as a result. So I think there are probably some other reasons, heat, weight, but I really think actually the military likes to have the noise in a lot of circumstances. Jonathan says, what is your favorite type of magazine for your AK-74 in terms of price, durability, and collectability or uniqueness? Well, that would be this, just a standard, what people call Bakelite, which is actually some sort of resin, AK-74 mag. Honestly, I don't find a whole lot of interesting collectability in 74 mags. Connor says, simple and easy one-word answer question, Beretta 92 or CZ75? CZ75. Nick says, if you had a signature cocktail, what would it be? I think a lot of good potential answers to that one. I think what I would end up going with would be a lion's tail. That is a cocktail of whiskey, lime juice, and allspice liqueur, or allspice dram. So that's got some unusual forgotten ingredients. It's got a good whiskey base. It's a well-balanced cocktail. All in all, a really nice cocktail that probably a lot of people haven't heard of, that I really enjoy. Robert Brown, high power or 1911? High power. Tony says, best semi-auto rifle of World War II, that would be the M1 Garand, unless you are including select fire rifles, in which case it would be the STG-44. Chaitanya says, if you could have one handgun to shoot at the range for the rest of your life, what would it be? At this point, I think it would be a Hudson H9. Jason, with your interest in firearms and history, have you ever been a reenactor? No. It's probably as a result of growing up out west in the US. I think the reenactment is much more prevalent on the East Coast. Honestly, I've never really found that much around me in the way of reenacting, and I don't know that I'd be all that interested in it. Reenacting, as far as I can tell, kind of gives you access to all of the most boring and unpleasant aspects of military service, not actually having access to a lot of guns or getting to do a lot of shooting or playing, learning about the guns. It's mostly about, how to live as a soldier, which isn't the part that I'm really particularly interested in recreating myself. Brandon, coffee or tea? I have a feeling you partake in French pressed café au lait. Not much of either, but tea more than coffee. Jeffrey says, does the new SIG 210 have the right feel and smell compared to the original version? Unfortunately, no. It seems pretty nice, but doesn't have the same smell, like metaphysical smell to it as an actual surplus military original SIG 210. Matt says, were you ever able to restore or convert the Gehendra you got from IMA a while back into something shootable? No, although not really so much because I wasn't able to, so much as I just gave up on the project because I had too many other things to do. I got an untouched, as they put it, Nepalese Gehendra rifle from IMA. Interestingly, I found like 3 cleaning patches jammed one on top of the other in the barrel. That was unexpected. And then once I tore the whole thing apart, there was actually substantial, pretty deep pitting in the barrel under the wood. And when I got to that point, I realized I'm not sure I'd be confident in actually using this barrel. I'd probably want to re-barrel it. And at that point, I just had too much other stuff going on. And that project, I got rid of those parts long ago. So there will never be anything more on that particular project. Sorry. Todd, you said in your State of the Channel video that you would be somewhere in Europe for Armistice Day, but didn't yet know where. If you could be anywhere you wanted on that day, where would it be and why? It's actually not so much about the physical geographical location as the other people and the events going on. So what I'm looking for is I want to find some really cool event commemorating the centenary. And that could be France, Belgium, England, Germany, Netherlands. Honestly, in theory, it could be in the US, but I think it's more likely to be in Europe somewhere. So hopefully I'll find something pretty cool before November rolls around. Another question from Todd. If you could bring back any pre-1930 weapon and make any necessary modernizations to it for today's market, what would it be? It'd be hard-pressed to say anything other than the Garand in 276. I think that was a pretty cool early rifle that had a lot going for it. It's like take an SKS and give it, you've got a 10-round capacity and an intermediate cartridge, but give it the handling and the sights and the trigger of the M1. I think that would be a pretty cool gun. exactly what cartridge it would be in is kind of up as a question, because there isn't really the cartridges that are out there that are ballistically compatible, similar to 276, are large cartridges that don't really fit the physical size of a rifle like that early version of the Garand. So honestly, probably would end up being one of the kind of the newfangled cartridges to make the AR-15 more effective than 5.56. One of the 6 or 6.5 millimeter rounds developed for the AR-15 magwell would probably be the best fit for a gun like that. Edward says, in your opinion, what is the most influential yet underappreciated firearm of the 20th century? I think I'm going to go with the AR-18 on that one. Not a lot of people give it a lot of credence. A lot of people look at it as, and this isn't, in my opinion, correct, but they look at it as it's like the gun that was developed for countries that couldn't afford to make proper AR-15s. And that's not really what that isn't its development history. But the gun itself never became all that popular or widespread. However, it is a very direct descendant of a huge number of the current issued combat rifles out there. Brian says, regarding stripper clips for bolt actions, after loading some clips, they can be ejected when the bolt is closed, where others have to be manually removed. Why is this? Is it something to do with the design of the bolt and stripper clip guide? Yeah, it's pretty much all in the design of the clip and the clip guide. It's just a question of whether you can design it so that the clip is stable enough to load and also loose enough to be able to be popped out by the bolt going forward. So Mauser clips you typically can. Something like a Mosin Nagant clip, where it's got higher sidewalls in order to properly fit and work with a rimmed cartridge, that generally isn't going to be able to be just knocked out by closing the bolt. His second question was, why is Japanese ammunition considered underpowered when compared to its counterparts? Is the type of powder and powder loading or some other mechanism? The answer is it's actually not underpowered. That is a myth that goes back to, I think, the 1940s. There was a lot of misunderstanding of Arisakas and Nambus and other Japanese firearms during World War II, partly played up by American propaganda about how terrible the Japanese were and thus how easy it would be to fight them. And just the fact that Americans had never really encountered these weapons before because they were Japanese military arms not out on the commercial market. Things like the Type 38 long rifle was designed in such a way that it really had almost no muzzle flash just because of good choices in powder. Reducing the amount of flash had nothing to do with the actual power of the cartridge. There are stories out there of like some Japanese machine guns requiring weaker powered ammunition in order to run properly, and those are all bunk. They didn't. They all ran on standard full power ammo. John says, do you hunt? I have hunted small game only. I have shot and eaten some rabbits. I would be interested in trying my hand at something larger, but I don't know when I'll have the opportunity to do so. Eric says, do you think the memes of you online are funny, annoying, or are you indifferent to them? The answer to that is all of the above. Some of them are just annoying from the beginning. Some of them are legitimately funny the first time and maybe the second time, but by the 85th time someone has sent them to me, they're kind of bland. I try to generally be indifferent to them. Christopher says, what firearm have you shot scared you the most, and have you ever bottled out firing one? I'm not entirely sure what bottled out means. The most nerve-wracking one that I've done in recent memory was actually that Swedish Freeburg Kjellman Swedish prototype rifle that had no bolt spring and just had this little kind of flimsy-looking guard that you'd lift up that acted as a safety. That was a little unnerving to shoot because you just don't know. You know, that rifle's 120 years old, give or take. And nobody in living memory has fired one, and I don't know that I want to be the guy who gets the bolt straight through my forehead. So that was a little nerve-wracking. Occasionally, some of like the really huge hunting rifles. I did a video a little while ago on a 950 JDJ rifle. We only had a couple rounds of ammunition for that. That was something I did in conjunction with Rock Island. There were a couple of their people there who were interested in shooting it. I'm like, you know what? I've done 4-bores. I've done 20mm cannons. I just don't know that I need to put myself through the enjoyment of touching something like that off. So, let's see. Donald says, oh, sorry, Tyler. Tyler's up here. First, favorite handgun, revolver or semi-auto? Semi-autos. Prefer those over revolvers. Donald says, why did Savage get out of the pistol market after what appeared to be broad commercial success? The answer is the Great Depression. Same reason Smith & Wesson got out of the pistol market after what wasn't all that successful. But the 1920s and 30s were just not a good time in the market to be selling firearms. People didn't have a lot of money. There were a ton of surplus firearms all washing around from the Great War. So even guns that had been popular, well, prices went down. Maybe it wasn't profitable to be making them anymore. Cody says, what is the worst military small arm fielded in the last 100-ish years, and why is it the 1895 Nagant revolver? The Nagant's pretty bad, although the Nagant actually works. It's got a heavy trigger, and it's got a kind of wimpy cartridge, but it does work, which some might argue makes it better than the L85A1, or maybe better than the INSAS, INSAS rifle. But yeah, the 1895 Nagant's pretty bad. James, what is your favorite movie prop weapon design? Well, I have a hard time really looking at them literally because they're just movie props. So they're not actually guns, and I have a hard time picturing them as actually being guns. So as a result, what that translates into is what is my favorite character, perhaps, who carries an unique prop firearm, and that would probably be Captain Malcolm Reynolds and his pistol, unfortunately built out of a Taurus revolver of all things. Ryan says, in your videos and examinations, have you ever accidentally broken, snapped, cracked, popped, dinged, or otherwise defaced any of the weapons you were looking at? Any ah shit moments that didn't make it onto tape? Well, there have been a lot of those kind of moments because typically the way it works is before I even set up the camera, I will disassemble and reassemble a firearm to make sure that I understand what I'm doing so that I can do it reasonably efficiently on camera instead of burning up a lot of battery and a lot of camera storage space doing take after take after take while I try and figure out what I'm doing. So usually the aw crap moments don't get on camera because once I've figured out how to do it and brought out the camera, they're less likely to happen. But I've had a number of parts go flying across rooms. The one that really comes to mind was a 1904 Webley revolver, where that's one, or not revolver, a 1904 Webley semi-auto that had the mainspring was actually a V-spring under one of the grip panels. And so I was messing around with the thing. I took the grip panel off, went, ah, cool, there's the mainspring. And there were actually two, I believe, one on each side. And then I flipped the gun over to do the same thing on the other side. And the mainspring was, it turns out, was held in place basically by the grip panel. And when I flipped it over, the spring went poink and fell out of the gun down onto the floor. And that was a serious pucker moment because my experience with V-springs like that is they are extremely stiff and very difficult to put back into place. And I was really worried that, oh God, I won't be able to get this thing back into the gun. And I'm going to have to go down to, you know, the auction house experts with a pile of gun parts and, you know, please help. As it turned out, fortunately, that spring was actually quite easy to put back in and didn't give me any trouble. I should say, I have broken a couple of guns, and you've seen them on camera. We had a reproduction FG42 from Rick Smith at SMG, and I mortar cleared that thing. We posted a picture of it in the video, but this was before the match, and we didn't actually have the camera running. I mortar cleared the thing and didn't have the gun perfectly vertical. It was kind of tilted on the toe of the stock, and I broke the third of the stock off. That was a major oops. However, the reason that doesn't happen, for example, at auction houses is what I am willing to do with a firearm is directly dependent on who owns it and how fragile it is and how valuable it is, et cetera, et cetera. So if it's a gun I own, or if it's a gun like that reproduction FG42 that was in current production, it's like there's no particular collectible value to the stock on that gun or to the butt plate, which is why I was willing to mortar clear it. I'm willing to do things that are more likely to damage the gun in that case. You may have also seen it on the video I did on the high standard 10B shotgun. That thing was a pile of garbage, and I did a lot of mortar clearing of that thing on what started off as a curved butt plate and ended up as a flat butt plate. Well, that was my own personally owned gun at the time, and so I was willing to do things that might damage it like that in a way that I don't do with guns that I don't own. I went really long on that one. Let's carry on. Will you be doing, from Christian, will you be doing more collaborations with Larry Vickers? Yes, definitely. I am continuing to work on some of the Vickers Guide books, and I also plan to do some filming with Larry. I don't know exactly what yet, but since we're going to be collaborating on the books and getting together, it only makes sense to do some video from time to time. Jim, have you ever seen and or fired the Ruger EC9 or EC9S? No, I in fact don't know what that is. James says, I'm thinking about getting a Hudson 9, but I have no way to so-called test drive one. Is it nice enough to buy on sight unseen? I would say yes. Now, because I'm on YouTube and because I just said that I like a thing, I'm obviously a well-known shill. To me, yeah, I really think it is worth it. Now, that does depend on your budget. I wouldn't stop eating dinner for a month in order to buy a Hudson, probably. But if you have the budget to buy an $1,147 pistol, yes, I think you can go into that one with confidence. Sean says, with advances in technology, would a rifle like the G11 be financially viable for major world powers? Financially viable isn't really the main problem with the G11. Working is the main problem with the G11. There's a reason that it never really got all the way through trials, and that is a combination of the ammunition being fragile and heat dispersion issues, and cost was part of it. But I think the cost problem of the G11 is largely the cost of spending the R&D time to fix all of its functional problems. Sasha says, are the Colt Canada Dymaco C7 and C8 platforms as better than the equivalent M14, M4, M16 platforms that their widespread international adoption with regular and SF forces would suggest? No, I don't think that the C7 and C8 have any real special magic sauce to them. They are very well-made rifles, and I think they're just economically, they make more sense. They're probably cheaper to buy than going through any of the American boutique companies, or, you know what, companies like, well, the mainstream large gun manufacturers in the US have had serious quality declines over recent years. And so I don't know that I blame anyone for, as a military, buying from Colt Canada. They make a really good product. They are making what a lot of the American companies ought to be making for ARs, and at a price point that American companies ought to be making. Edward says, one of the aspects of your show I enjoy the most is watching the evolution of firearms designs during the last 300 years. With that evolution in mind, would you agree that current 21st century firearms are the best that have ever existed? Yes, unquestionably. Not all of them. We've got some crappy guns right now, but yeah, I think the best guns that have been made are being made now, or could be made now. Hartley says, do you think the 7.62x51 was in retrospect pretty much pointless? Given the stock of 30-06 around the world, in the US as well as the similar ballistics, was it worth all the trouble for the small weight and length savings? When you put it that way, it's hard to argue that 308 was a wise idea. I think certainly the interesting question to me is, had the 30-06 or had the 7.62 NATO not been insisted upon by the US at NATO trials, and had they instead gone to one of the lighter cartridges like the British were proposing, how would that have impacted adoption of the 5.56 NATO cartridge? And I really don't know. It might have made no difference at all. We might have had, 10 years of 280-30 and then gone to 5.56, or maybe the AR-10 platform would have been developed in a more intermediate size cartridge, and maybe the M16 never would have existed. It's an interesting question. Next page. John, sorry for the weird one, but have you ever reflected on the odd coincidence of long-lived national armories being established in both Tula and tulle within 20 years, 200 years of each other, 300 years ago, or within about 20 years of each other, about 300 years ago. The first time I heard you refer to tulle, I was wondering what in the hell Russia was doing making French rifles. Well, it is, first off, kind of funny that the opposite is true. Châtellerault, a French arsenal, made Russian rifles under contract, made most of the Nagants for a couple years. However, that aside, no, I actually never thought about that myself until I started seeing comments about it on the video. It's a funny coincidence. I don't think it's anything more than that. Mikhail or Michael says, what do you use to edit your videos? The answer is Final Cut Pro 10. Thomas, can you show us modern Japanese rifles? They are kind of forgotten since release. Well, not easily. As I mentioned earlier, prior to World War II, most Americans had no experience with Arisakas because they were Japanese military rifles that weren't on the commercial market. Well, the same thing is true for current Japanese military rifles. They are quite touchy about firearms in Japan these days, and there's not really any export of Japanese military arms. So at some point, it would be cool to go to Japan and be able to bring you guys content on some of those. That would definitely require developing some contacts that I do not have at this point. So certainly be up for it in the future. Who knows when it might happen. Email says, how much time is there on average between a video being filmed and being uploaded? There is no good average. Some of them go up within a week. It's generally not less than a week at this point because basically because of YouTube's monetization policies. I have to upload the video and then I have to give it a couple days to see if it's going to get flagged, and if it almost inevitably does get flagged, then you put it in for a manual review, and that usually takes a couple days. So I don't like to have less than a week, just to make sure that everything's all copacetic by the time the video publishes. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, I think I have some videos that have gotten close to 8 or 10 months from when they were filmed before they were posted. What I typically do when I'm visiting somewhere is film a whole slew of videos, but then I don't want to publish them all in a row because often they have kind of some themes to them, and I don't want people to get too bored with repetitive sort of content. I really like being able to publish, in a given week, publish a video from England, a video from Scandinavia, a video from South America, and a video from the US, something like that. So having a bunch of videos from several different trips and then using them intermittently over the course of 6 months is probably a pretty good time frame usually. Usually within 6 months, I'll have used all the video from a given trip. Next up, Brenton says, just how big is your box of moldy web gear, and is it close to growing able to enter a match on its own accord? I actually don't have one box of moldy web gear. I have my moldy web gear segregated out by country, and I have a bunch of different boxes. I have a bunch of American, a bunch of British, a bunch of French, a bunch of Russian, some German, some Italian, some Israeli, some South African. There's a bunch of those boxes. And in order to make sure that they don't get out of line, I do make sure not to store any firearms in the boxes with potentially sentient moldy web gear. Molly says, I have heard stories of how in World War I, before the development of anti-tank rifles, soldiers would use mail-order big game hunting rifles to defeat armor, either tanks or otherwise. Is there any truth to this, and are there any notable instances of civilian rifles being drafted to serve a vacant military niche? Yeah, that is actually entirely true. Early in World War I, the British, and I want to say the Germans as well. Well, for armor, I think it was primarily the British, did use safari-type large, well, not necessarily large caliber, but powerful civilian rifles to shoot at like German armored loopholes in trenches. And they did work. They punched through armor that a standard .303 round wouldn't. Now that didn't last very long. Similarly, the Germans also used a lot of civilian rifles during World War I, particularly as sniping rifles. The use of civilian scoped hunting rifles was quite common early in World War I, or rather quite common relative to sniper rifles. So until countries managed to put together an official military program, and in some cases, they never really were able to put into production military optics. The British, for example, pretty much just always used commercial optics through World War I on their snipers. So that sort of specialty role, yeah, they definitely did make use of civilian guns. Jordan says, 20 plus years from now, which is more likely to be a forgotten weapon? The Scar 16, the Bushmaster ACR, or the CZ Bren? Well, I would say the Bushmaster ACR qualifies right now. The Bren will fairly shortly, and the Scar will probably be the longest lasting of the bunch. Matthew says, what obsolete rifle or pistol cartridge would you like to see make a comeback? That's an easy one. 7.65 French long. I would love to be able to get that ammo so that I could use my Moss 38 submachine gun, and also because in particular, the French 1935A pistol is a really nice pistol that's virtually impossible to shoot because you can't get that ammunition. It actually is the direct ancestor of the SIG 210, which is another fantastically excellent pistol. Will says, howdy Ian, you stated that the Colt Monitor was the coolest and best version of the BAR. Knowing you shot the Monitor, the 1918A3, the semi-auto gun from Ohio Ordnance, the Polish WZ-28 on camera, and I'm guessing others, why is the Monitor the ultimate BAR variant, or am I just misunderstanding you in that it's the coolest? Little of both. What makes the Monitor the most interesting BAR variant to me is that the 1918A2 kind of sucks, in my opinion. The 1918 is nice, but it's not, I mean, it's a very early firearm and suffers from a lot of problems like the show shot did. It needed to be refined. The refined versions, however, the Swedish, the Polish, the Belgian versions of the BAR, those, what they end up being are perfectly effective light machine guns, but not great. They're always a little heavier than maybe they ought to be. They are limited to 20-round magazines typically. There are reasons why most light machine guns ended up having top-mounted magazines. You're able to put in a larger capacity magazine much more easily than if you had it sticking out the bottom of the gun. The Monitor kind of goes in a different route, and the Monitor is a development trying to make the BAR into a shoulder-fired automatic weapon. And I think it does that in a very interesting way, and it was a lot of fun to shoot, and there aren't a whole lot of other guns that kind of fit that role as well as I think the Monitor did. Now, it's a role that doesn't really have much practical application, in that you'd be comparing the Monitor to things like a full auto G3 and a full auto FAL, and largely because of its weight, it's more effective in full auto than those rifles, in my opinion. But that's not really something that a lot of people are looking for outside of just recreational shooting. William asks, how is my father doing, and why haven't you included him in more of your videos on Japanese firearms? He is doing just fine. However, it's been actually some time since he was really all that interested in firearms. He collected Arisakas when I was growing up, and a little after I left college, he just kind of lost interest and moved on to other things. So that is the reason that I ended up with a bunch of his Arisaka collection. And we discuss them from time to time, but he lives far away from me, so it's not convenient to get him on camera a lot, and it's just not something he's interested in very much these days. Next up, Justin says, are you still planning on doing a video on the Aloft shotgun you showed in one of your early Q&As from like 5 years ago? I tried to find it, but either I'm bad at finding things or you've been too busy to get to it. I have been too busy to get to it. I still have it. I still plan to do a video on it. It is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a single-shot break-action shotgun with a bolt-on adapter to turn it into a 4-round repeater. It is super cool and super kludgy. It's a giant mousetrap on the side of the gun. It's really cool. It requires some pretty specific length of ammunition. So not just like mini shells versus 60 versus 70 millimeter shells. It's different brands. You have to get the shells just the right length so that they actually cycle that Rube Goldberg contraption on the gun. I promise I will get to it eventually, but I don't know when. Mike says, your dog is showing up in more videos filmed in your house. What is his or her name, and how did you acquire him or her? That is Dharma. She is an Australian cattle dog. I don't think she's purebred. She probably has a little bit of terrier or something in her. And she actually showed up at a friend's back door during the summer, actually in July of all times, here in Tucson. Showed up at the back door with a sibling, and he put out water to make them go away. That obviously didn't work. The next day they were still there. So he suggested to a couple friends that they might be interested, and I now have a dog. She was 6 weeks old when that happened, so we've had her since she was a little tiny puppy. Nathan, most useful firearms tool. Pen doesn't count. Sorry? Pen's pretty much it. And the reason is basically a non-marring pushing device is, in my experience, the most useful firearms tool, because you can use it in a whole lot of different places, whether it is trying to push out pins or holding bolts open or trying to push on a spring that's on a small little slippery piece. If you're going to refuse to allow a pen, I would say a tapered polymer pin would be or punch would be the most valuable single tool. Nothing replaces a whole punch set and screwdriver set, though. Gore says, with the U.S. experimenting with ships armed with railguns, do you think firearms of the future will follow similar methods of propulsion? I think, yeah, people would be very interested in shoulder-fired railguns, but that is all predicated on a massive increase in energy storage technology. So you're going to need a doozy of a battery to make something like that feasible. And that's the sort of discovery that I suppose could happen tomorrow or might not happen for 1,000 years. That's one of those things where it's kind of interesting to look at some science fiction like Star Trek. And you look at it and go, well, some of this we absolutely have. In fact, we have better than they had in the show. Communicators and tricorders, that sort of thing. You know, my smartphone does way more than anything Gene Roddenberry theorized in that show. Transporter technology doesn't look like we'll have it for 1,000 years. So batteries capable of storing power for shoulder-fired railguns could fall into either of those categories, and we'll just never know until it happens or doesn't. Philip, any plans to come to Norway? Not specific plans, but I would certainly like to. Cyrus, I like straight pulls. K11, K31, or Steyr M95 first. I would say first the K11, because it and the K31 are both very nice guns. The K11 is harder to find, so I would start with that. I would get a K31 second, and I would be perfectly content to not ever have a Steyr M95 unless it was something I was very specifically interested in. As a shooter, I'm not a big fan of those carbines. They are brutal. Joseph says, what are the Wonder Nines? That is the generic name given to the profusion of polymer-framed double-stack 9mm military and police style of pistols that came out in the wake of the Glock becoming a bit popular. Timo says, when are you planning to visit the Czech Republic? I have no idea. Another one, I'd like to do it. It's on the list. You know, the number of international trips I can take and the amount of time I can spend on them is simply limited by practicality. And I have far more countries on the list I would like to visit than I have time in any given year to visit. So, can't tell you. Sorry. Scott, would you shoot a low number 1903? No. Not necessarily because I think it would actually explode on me, but because a low number 1903 is going to generally be more expensive and more coveted than a random generic later production one. And if I wanted to shoot one, I would get a later production one to shoot. If I had a low number one, I would leave it as the collectible that it really is. Jordan, BM59 parts kit build, yay or nay? I would say yay. Good luck with the receiver. The problem with a BM59 build is finding a proper receiver. The original BM59s had stripper clip guides, kind of like the M14. And you find that on almost none of the available converted Garand receivers that people are making BM59s on. So if I was going to do a BM59 build, which I might actually have mailed out this very morning, I would do it. I would try to find a receiver with a stripper clip guide on it so the gun was actually correct. That's going to be difficult. They were made by Beretta. They're not very common to find. Where am I here? Joshua, if you could get your hands on only one of the firearms from the 1980s Advanced Combat Rifle Program, which would it be? Despite having just badmouthed it a few minutes ago, an HK-G11. AJ says, has YouTube given your account any strikes? And if so, what videos, and have you challenged them? Yes, I actually have one community guideline strike as we speak. It is for a video I did at Rock Island on the LAR Grizzly. I have absolutely no idea why that got a community guideline strike. I absolutely appealed it, both through the automated process and through direct email to a YouTube representative. I'm still waiting to hear back on that. I got that strike on Christmas Day. Awesome Christmas present. And as of the filming of this video, it's been close to 2 weeks, I think, and it's still in limbo. So no idea. Semillion says, do you think US and NATO made a mistake by enforcing .308 as the standard caliber over full adoption of the .280 British? We kind of actually talked about that already. I don't know that I would have necessarily pushed for .280, but it would have been interesting to see what other ideas were played out and what the results of testing were had there not been the overarching US insistence on what became 7.62 by 51. Michael, what is your favorite shootable, i.e. not handmade Chinese, 32 ACP pistol? Well, I'm going to bend the definition of pistol a little bit, and I'm going to say the VZ61 Scorpion in its full auto form. That thing is super cool, and I really wish I could have one. Unfortunately, there are I don't know if there are actually any transferable ones. There might be a couple. They're going to be ludicrously expensive because of their scarcity, if there are any. But that's a shame. I'd love to have a Scorpion. A real Scorpion, not... As a semi-auto pistol, those things are kind of unimpressive. Taylor says, what do you think about the Polish WZ35, what is commonly called the Radom, returning to production? Do you think it will compete well with newer designs? This is based on a news story that the Radom factory, which, by the way, has always managed to keep a set of the technical package for the Viz35 pistol. I've seen it at SHOT Show. They have a demo pistol. They've been trying to find someone who's willing to place a big enough order for those things to justify putting them into production. Everything I had heard had been that nobody had expressed that much interest in them. Now it appears maybe someone has. I don't think it will do all that well. I think the problem is there are enough of them still on the market and available that Radom really can't compete price-wise. And would you really... Most people, I think, would rather have an original one than a brand new one. Maybe there's a different market dynamic in Poland and elsewhere in Europe where they might be able to sell these. But while I like the Viz35, I don't see that being a very successful commercial endeavor in the US. Where are we here? Eric says, what kind of hearing protection do you recommend? As someone who fires all sorts of firearms, what really works well? I am a really big fan of the little squishy foam earplugs. I don't really like ear muffs because they just always seem to cause issues with cheek weld on rifles. And honestly, the little squishies in the ear seem to work as well as anything else I've ever used. They're convenient, they're cheap, they're easy to carry around. If you lose them, no big deal. You can always have spares. That's what I use for pretty much anything. I guess the one exception would be at indoor ranges. I use those and earmuffs, and I try not to. I really don't like indoor ranges. I've been spoiled by shooting outside, and it's just a lot more pleasant outside. If I have to use an indoor range, I double up on ear protection. Green Ruin says, this might be too complex to answer concisely, but is pistol accuracy particularly relevant to the military and law enforcement markets? The range and size of targets plus relatively little training compared to civilian target shooters seems like adopting a much cheaper gun that is less accurate could be a valid choice. I kind of agree. Although I don't think you actually have to adopt a cheaper gun. I think it's just a matter of most people in general cannot shoot as well as their handguns can. And so spending extra money to get a handgun that is more accurate than something that is generally of high quality is probably wasted money for most people. And that includes police and law enforcement. Last page here. Kyle says, easy question, P14 or Type 99 Arisaka rifle? That's not quite so easy of a question. If it were an M1917, I would definitely take that. But if basically what I have to choose between here is the handling of, .303 and its stripper clips are a giant pain, and I think they're enough of a pain that given that choice, I would take a Type 99 Arisaka. BR Waldo, do you see any reason why the magazine forward of the grip layout for pistols, for example the Mauser C96, would make a comeback? No, I don't think so. With the invention of the pistol slide, we are able to put the magazine in the grip and make everything a lot more compact and handier and generally better. M says, what is one forgotten weapon you've come across under $500 to $600 to purchase these days that you think everyone should add to their collection, and why? I am loath to actually answer that question because everyone has different collections. Your collection shouldn't be what some dude on the internet says you ought to buy. Your collection should be things you are actually legitimately interested in yourself. That being said, a Swiss straightpull rifle. Those things are way cheaper than they ought to be. They won't be forever. They're fantastic shooting rifles. They're mechanically interesting rifles, and you ought to have one. K31, Gewehr 96, Gewehr 11, Carabiner 31, take your pick, but you should have one of them. And last question here is from Campbell. It says, with all the time you spend researching, traveling, and making videos for both Forgotten Weapons and in-range TV, do you ever have time to take your own guns out to the range? The answer is not as much time as I would like, actually, unfortunately. A large part of my recreational shooting is actually the two-gun match that I do regularly, which we film for in-range. So that's a handy way to get kind of double dip. We get video content, and it's my opportunity to go out and have fun shooting. So anyway, that is like 7 pages of questions for today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this format. Let me know either way down in the comments. And of course, if you would like to have your question in the running for next month's Q&A, go ahead and sign up over at patreon.com/forgottenweapons to help support the channel. Everybody there from $2 and up per month gets notification on Patreon when I'm looking for questions, and I'll take your questions. I can't guarantee I answer everything, but I answer as much as I can. Thanks for watching.